The hospital was never meant to feel like a battlefield. But tonight, the emergency ward doors slam shut as alarms begin to echo through the corridors. Patients are pushed under beds. Monitors scream with unstable heart rates. Security radios break into chaos, unidentified armed intruders inside the building. In the middle of it all, a quiet ward nurse continues her rounds. No panic in her steps. No change in her expression. A man bleeding on the floor grabs her wrist and whispers that the attackers are moving floor to floor. She simply looks toward the sealed corridor doors, as if she has seen this kind of silence before the storm. And when the first gunshot cracks through the hospital walls, nothing about her reaction makes sense to anyone watching. Because she does not move away from the danger. She moves toward it. And what happens next will force everyone to realize they were wrong about who she really is. The hospital ward was calm in the way only late-night hospitals can be, quiet, but never truly still. Soft fluorescent lights hummed above the corridors. A cleaning cart moved slowly across polished floors, wheels faintly squeaking at every turn. Monitors blinked in steady rhythm behind half-closed curtains. Outside the glass windows, the city looked distant and indifferent, as if nothing in the world could ever reach inside these walls. Inside Ward 4B, the nurse moved from bed to bed without hesitation. She checked 4 lines with steady hands. Adjusted oxygen flow. Replaced a folded blanket on an elderly patient who was sleeping too lightly to be fully at peace. Every action was precise, controlled, unhurried. Other staff noticed her, but rarely spoke about her. "She's too quiet," one of the junior nurses had once said during a break. Not unkindly. Just unsure how to read her. She never joined the small conversations at the desk. Never reacted to gossip. Never rushed, even when the ward became busy. It wasn't that she ignored people. It was that she seemed to operate slightly outside the noise of everyone else. Tonight was no different. A monitor beeped softly from the far bed. A middle-aged man shifted in his sleep, grimacing in discomfort. She was there within seconds, adjusting his line before the alarm could escalate. The sound stopped immediately. The man relaxed again. No words exchanged. Just correction. Then silence. At the nurse's station, 2 staff members glanced at her as she passed. "She doesn't talk much, does she?" one said. The other shrugged. "New transfers are like that sometimes. Or maybe she just doesn't like night shifts." They went back to their paperwork. But the woman they were discussing had already moved past them, hearing every word without reacting to any of it. Down the corridor, the hospital security door clicked once as it automatically relocked after a routine check. She glanced at it for less than a second. Not suspicious. Just noting. Like someone memorizing a pattern. A patient in bed 7 coughed violently. She turned instantly, already prepared before the sound fully finished. She checked his vitals, adjusted his position, and waited until his breathing stabilized. Only then did she step back. The patient, half awake, looked at her. "You're always here," he whispered. She nodded once. Nothing more. Time passed in controlled silence. Outside the ward, distant ambulance sirens came and went. Inside, the rhythm of hospital life remained predictable. Machines, footsteps, occasional paging announcements over the intercom. Then, for the first time that night, something broke the rhythm. A door at the end of the corridor did not close properly. It stayed half-latched for a moment longer than it should have. A junior orderly noticed it and walked over, slightly annoyed. He pushed it shut harder than necessary. The lock engaged with a sharp click. Normal again. Or so it seemed. The nurse watched the entire sequence without moving. Her expression did not change, but her attention narrowed, subtle, invisible to anyone not trained to notice stillness. She turned away and continued her rounds. At the far end of the ward, an elderly woman spoke softly in her sleep. "Don't let them in." A meaningless phrase. Dreams often pulled words from nowhere. Still, the nurse paused for half a second longer than necessary. Then she continued walking. Near the medication station, a small radio crackled with static. The charge nurse adjusted the volume and frowned. "Probably interference again," she said casually. No one paid attention. But the nurse had already looked toward the source of the interference before anyone else reacted. Her movements remained unchanged, her posture steady, her face calm. Yet something in the atmosphere had subtly shifted, too small for most to notice, too structured for it to be coincidence. At 1:47 a.m., the hospital lights flickered once. A brief dip. A momentary shadow moving across sterile white walls. Somewhere deep in the building, a heavy door opened where it should not have. And in Ward 4B, the quiet nurse stopped at the end of the hallway. Not because she was told. Not because of an alarm. But because something in the silence had finally changed its shape. She looked toward the corridor leading deeper into the hospital's restricted wing. And for the first time that night, she did not immediately move on. She simply observed. Like someone waiting for a pattern to confirm itself. Like someone who already knew what normal would stop being very soon. The first sign that something was wrong did not come as an alarm. It came as absence. A missing update on the internal communication board. A delayed security status check. A hallway camera feed that froze for 3 seconds too long before resuming as if nothing had happened. In a hospital, small delays are common. But tonight, they stacked on top of each other like pressure building under sealed glass. Ward 4B continued its routine, unaware of what was forming beyond its walls. The nurse moved between beds as usual, checking vitals, adjusting lines, recording subtle changes in patient conditions. Her pace never changed. Neither did her expression. But her attention was no longer fully inside the ward. It was split. Listening outward. A junior doctor passed by the station, speaking quickly into his phone. "No, I don't know why the lower cameras are down. IT says it's being fixed." He stopped mid-sentence when he noticed the nurse standing nearby. For a brief moment, he seemed embarrassed, as if he had spoken too loudly. Then he walked away. The nurse continued forward without reacting. But she had already registered the phrase, "lower cameras." At 2:03 a.m., a security guard entered the ward corridor faster than usual. His steps were controlled, but his posture carried tension that did not belong in routine night duty. He spoke into his radio in a low voice. "Repeat, confirm unauthorized access." Static answered him. Not silence. Not clarity. Just distortion. The guard slowed as he passed the nurse's station, eyes scanning doors instead of people. One of the staff tried to stop him. "What's going on?" He hesitated for half a second too long. "System issue," he said. "Stay in your assigned area." But his voice did not match his words. The nurse watched him continue down the corridor toward restricted access. Not following. Not reacting. Only observing direction, speed, hesitation. A pattern forming in motion. In bed 12, a young patient shifted uncomfortably. His oxygen mask fogged slightly as he spoke. "There were men earlier," he said weakly. A nurse leaned closer. "What men?" "They weren't doctors. They were standing near the service elevator. They didn't move when I passed." The statement should have been dismissed easily. But something about the way he said it made the room feel slightly tighter. The charge nurse forced a calm tone. "You were probably still groggy from sedation." The patient nodded, uncertain. Case closed. Officially. But not completely. The ward nurse stood near the supply cabinet, quietly restocking gloves. She did not join the conversation, but she had heard every word. Service elevator. Restricted access. Lower cameras down. Timing mismatch. Her eyes shifted briefly toward the far end of the corridor again. Still calm. Still controlled. But now aligned. At 2:11 a.m., the intercom crackled unexpectedly. Not an announcement. A broken transmission. "All units, possible breach, containment protocol." The message cut off. The room did not react immediately. Hospitals often experience technical noise. False alerts. Interrupted feeds. People have learned to ignore uncertainty. But the nurse did not ignore it. She simply paused. Not frozen. Measured. Then she finished placing the last glove into the dispenser and turned slightly toward the corridor. At the same moment, somewhere deep in the building, a heavy metallic sound echoed. Not loud, but deliberate. A door that should not have been opened. A system that should not have failed. And now, no longer a possibility, only confirmation. The guard radioed again, voice sharper. Lockdown may be incoming. Prepare for controlled isolation. The word lockdown spread faster than the system itself. Staff began exchanging glances. Movement became less fluid. Patients sensed the change before they understood it. The hospital had shifted from routine to response. The nurse walked to the edge of the ward, stopping just short of the corridor intersection. From here, she could see two directions. One toward safety procedures. One toward restricted internal access. She did not move immediately. Instead, she watched the staff begin to unconsciously reorganize, closing curtains, checking doors, repositioning patients closer to exits. Human response trying to restore control. But control had already started to slip elsewhere. A distant sound echoed again. This time closer, faster, and heavier. The nurse's gaze remained fixed on the corridor leading deeper into the hospital structure. Not fear. Not confusion. Recognition. Something had crossed the boundary. And now the hospital was no longer only a place of care. It was becoming something else. The hospital did not announce the breach with clarity. It arrived as fragmented information. A rushed voice over radio. A partial code repeated twice. Then silence that lasted too long for anyone to trust. Ward 4B felt the change before it was confirmed. Footsteps outside the corridor became faster. Heavier. No longer routine movement between departments, but directed urgency. Doors that usually opened and closed gently now shut with sharp force, as if people were trying to seal time itself inside rooms. The nurse remained in the same position near the corridor edge. Still. Listening. At 2:19 a.m., the overhead intercom finally spoke again. Security alert. Unauthorized individuals confirmed in lower surgical levels. All non-essential staff remain in secured wards. The message ended abruptly, as if cut mid-sentence. No explanation followed. No reassurance. Just procedure. A junior nurse behind the station stood up immediately. Is this a drill? No one answered. Because drills are always clearly labeled. And this was not. The charge nurse moved quickly, trying to stabilize the situation with familiar structure. Stay calm. Lock patient records. Secure 4 stations. No one leaves the ward. Her voice was steady, but slightly higher than normal. Controlled panic disguised as authority. The patients were beginning to sense it now. Not from words. From behavior. In bed 9, a man tried to sit up. What's happening? He asked. No one gave him a full answer. Because no one had a complete one. Only fragments. The nurse moved past him, adjusting his blanket so he would remain stable. Her hand rested briefly on the bed frame as she did it, steadying not just him, but the situation around him without acknowledgement. Then she looked down the corridor again. This time, the sound changed. Not footsteps. Not alarms. A distant metallic impact. Followed by a second. Then a pause. Then movement again, closer, more structured. Like teams advancing through predefined paths. A security officer entered the ward corridor, breathing controlled but sharp at the edges. Lower-level breach confirmed, he said into his radio. Multiple hostiles moving through service access points. The word hostiles did not belong in hospital language. It changed everything without needing explanation. Behind him, another staff member asked quietly, "Are we safe here?" The officer hesitated. That hesitation was the answer no one wanted. The nurse observed this exchange without interrupting it. She did not ask questions. She did not react outwardly. But her eyes tracked the officer's route, the direction he came from, the time it took him to arrive. Data without a screen. At 2:26 a.m., the hospital lighting flickered again, longer this time. A half-second too extended to be ignored. Emergency backup systems engaged with a low mechanical hum. Red corridor indicators activated in sections far down the building. The structure itself was changing state. A system transition. Containment mode. From somewhere deeper in the hospital, a loud crash echoed, closer than before. Followed by shouting. Not clear words. Not organized commands. Just urgency colliding with resistance. Patients in Ward 4B began to panic. A woman stood up near the window. "I want to leave." A nurse immediately guided her back to bed. "Stay here. Doors are secured." But the word secured no longer carried comfort. It carried restriction. The nurse at the center of the ward finally moved. Not quickly. Not slowly. Precisely. She walked to the supply cabinet and checked its latch. Then the oxygen cylinder placement. Then the emergency kit alignment. Small confirmations. Not of medical readiness. Of spatial awareness. Of exits. Of control points. A junior doctor watched her and frowned slightly. "You're very calm," he said. She did not look at him immediately. When she did, her expression remained unchanged. "Calm helps patients," she replied simply. He nodded, but uncertainty remained in his eyes. Because calm in chaos is not always reassuring. Sometimes it is unfamiliar. A distant sound of shouting grew louder. Now clearly within the hospital structure. Not outside. Inside. Security radio chatter intensified, overlapping, breaking apart. "They're moving through East Corridor." "Seal the junction." "Repeat, we've lost visual." Then another impact echoed through the building. Closer again. Ward 4B's doors locked automatically. A mechanical click sealed the corridor access. Some patients gasped. Others froze. The charge nurse stepped forward. "Everyone stay." But her voice stopped as the next sound arrived. Footsteps outside the ward door. Multiple. Slow. Measured. Intentional. They stopped directly outside. No rushing. No confusion. Just presence. The entire ward held still. Even the machines seemed quieter, as if the environment itself was listening. The nurse stood slightly to the side of the main corridor line of sight. Not hiding. Not exposing herself. Positioned. The door handle outside turned once. Then stopped. A pause. Long enough for everyone inside to feel it. And then a knock. Not aggressive. Not chaotic. Controlled. As if whoever was outside already knew exactly what they were doing. The hospital had crossed its first real boundary. And Ward 4B was no longer untouched. It was next. The knock did not repeat. It did not need to. Because silence after it carried more weight than sound. Ward 4B remained frozen for a fraction of time that felt longer than minutes. Patients stopped moving. Even breathing seemed uncertain, as if the room itself was deciding whether it should continue functioning normally. Then the hospital system responded. A deep mechanical tone echoed through the building. Not an alarm. A protocol activation sound. The kind that was designed to override human interpretation. Lockdown protocol initiated. All departments remain in secured containment zones. The intercom voice was calm. Too calm. As if it had been trained not to acknowledge fear. The door to Ward 4B remained sealed. But now it was no longer just a door. It was a boundary. Outside, footsteps shifted. Not retreating. Repositioning. The sound of organized movement replaced randomness. Whoever was on the other side was not confused. They were mapping the hospital in real time. The charge nurse moved toward the center of the ward, forcing stability into her voice. "No one goes near the doors. We stay inside until security clears the corridor." No one questioned her. But no one looked fully reassured either. Because, until security clears, had stopped meaning certainty. It now meant delay. And delay meant exposure. The nurse stood near the corridor junction again. Same position as before. But the environment had changed around her. Now every sound carried structure. Distant doors locking. Elevator systems halting. Emergency shutters engaging deeper in the hospital. Containment was spreading. A junior doctor whispered, "If this is lockdown, why are we still hearing movement outside?" No one answered. Because lockdown does not remove threats. It isolates them inside the same system. The nurse shifted her gaze slightly toward the ceiling. Listening. Not to voices. To patterns. The hospital was speaking in infrastructure. At 2:41 a.m., the lights dimmed again. This time, they did not return fully to normal white. Emergency corridor lighting engaged in red segments, casting the ward in a muted, uneasy glow. Patients looked around, unsettled by the color change. A child in one bed began to cry quietly. A nurse moved to comfort him, but her movements were slower than before. Careful, but distracted. The sense of control was thinning. Then came another sound. Not outside the ward. Inside the building. Metallic sliding. Followed by a controlled impact. Then another. Someone was moving through sealed corridors using force where systems resisted. Security radio erupted again. They bypassed second containment door. How did they get access codes? We are losing East Wing control. Repeat, losing control. The phrase losing control repeated twice before cutting off. Ward 4B had stopped being a passive space. It was now part of the map. A point of interest. The nurse finally moved away from the corridor junction. But not toward safety. Toward the center of the ward. Where visibility was highest. Where patients could see her. Where decisions would become visible, not hidden. The charge nurse noticed her movement immediately. "Where are you going?" she asked quickly. The nurse paused just long enough to register the question. Then replied calmly. "Checking patients." It was true, but incomplete, because she was also counting distances. Between beds. Between exits. Between possible entry angles. A security officer arrived at the ward-windowed observation panel outside the corridor. His face was tense. He spoke through the intercom. "Stay inside. Do not approach corridor doors under any circumstances." Then he hesitated. Movement is confirmed in adjacent wing. No further explanation. He disappeared from view quickly after that, leaving only uncertainty behind. Inside Ward 4B, tension condensed further. Patients began asking questions that no one could answer properly. How long will this last? Is anyone coming? Are we safe here? Each question made the room smaller. The nurse moved between beds again. Not rushing. Not avoiding. Maintaining function. A man on oxygen reached for her sleeve weakly. "If they come in," he started. She adjusted his mask slightly. "You will stay still," she said softly. Not reassurance. Instruction. Simple. Grounded. Outside the door, movement stopped again. Then silence returned. A different kind this time. Not absence. Presence held back. The charge nurse stepped closer to the door panel display. It showed partial system failure warnings. Then fluctuating access status. Then a final change. Manual override attempted. Her face tightened. "They're trying to open it," she said quietly. No one responded. Because everyone already understood. The nurse looked toward the door as well. Not fearfully. Not urgently. Just acknowledging reality. Then, for the first time since the lockdown began, she stepped closer to the corridor line again, positioning herself where anyone entering would see her first. Not behind cover. Not in retreat. But exactly in the path of first contact. Outside, the handle turned again. This time longer. More deliberate. The lock held. For now. But the pressure against it suggested certainty, not doubt. Ward 4B was no longer waiting for news. It was waiting for entry. And for the first time, someone inside was no longer positioned like a nurse reacting to chaos, but like someone who understood exactly where chaos would step next. The door did not break. It opened. Not suddenly. Not violently. But with controlled force, as if whoever stood outside already knew the lock's limits better than the system that built it. A narrow gap appeared first. Then wider. Light from the corridor spilled into Ward 4B, cutting through the red emergency glow like a blade. For a moment, no one moved. The ward held its breath. Then an armed intruder stepped inside. Helmet. Tactical vest. Face partially covered. Weapon lowered but ready. He scanned the room slowly. Not chaotic. Professional. Behind him, another shadow shifted in the corridor but did not fully enter. This was not random violence. It was organized entry. The first intruder's eyes moved across the ward, patients, staff, exits. Then he spoke. "Stay where you are." Simple words. No shouting. No emotion. The kind of command used when control is already assumed. A patient near the center made a small movement. Instinctive fear. The intruder's weapon tilted slightly in response. Not fired. Just corrected. The room froze again. Except for one person. The nurse. She did not step forward. She did not step back. She remained exactly where she had positioned herself before the door opened. Visible. Still. The intruder noticed her. His gaze paused for half a second longer than the others. Something about her did not match expectation. Not uniformed security. Not panic. Not submission. Just stillness. He spoke again, slightly lower. "You. Back away from the patients." The command was direct. Targeted. The nurse did not respond immediately. Instead, she looked past him. Not at the weapon. Not at the man. At the corridor behind him. Counting. Distance. Backup presence. Timing between entries. Then she looked back at him. "No one here is a threat," she said calmly. Her voice was not loud, but it carried clarity that did not belong to panic. The intruder hesitated. Just a fraction. Enough to be noticed. Behind him, the second figure shifted closer to the doorway but did not enter fully. Uncertainty was spreading. Not in the ward. In them. The charge nurse whispered, "Stay down, please just stay down." But the nurse in the center of the room did not lower herself. She stepped forward one pace. Not toward aggression. Toward alignment. Positioning herself between patients and entry line. The intruder's weapon raised slightly. "Stop moving." She stopped. Immediately. Not because of fear. Because she had reached the exact point she intended. A patient behind her whispered, "Don't." She did not turn. Her attention remained fixed forward. The intruder studied her again. Something in his training did not fit this scenario. Hospitals were supposed to collapse under pressure, not organize themselves within it. A distant sound echoed through the corridor behind the intruders. More movement approaching. Their attention flickered for a second. That was enough. The nurse moved. Not fast. Not dramatic. Controlled repositioning. A single step that shifted her angle relative to both intruder and corridor. Not escape. Not attack. Position correction. The intruder reacted instantly. Weapon followed. But he did not fire. Because something else had changed. Behind the nurse, a second staff member had already pulled patients deeper into cover zones without noise. The ward was reorganizing itself around her movement. Not commanded. Aligned. The intruder realized it. This was not a passive room anymore. It was structured response under pressure. And she was the center of it. The second figure at the doorway spoke into a radio. Short words. Unclear. But urgent. The first intruder's stance shifted slightly. Uncertainty increasing. He looked again at the nurse. "You are not supposed to be in our way," he said. She replied without raising her voice. "I am not in your way." A pause. Then, quietly, "You are in mine." The statement did not sound threatening. It sounded factual. That difference changed the atmosphere more than any weapon could. A distant alarm finally triggered in another wing. Security movement increased in the background. Time was no longer static. The intruders knew it. The nurse knew it. And the ward, quiet, trapped, watching, understood only one thing. The situation had stopped being about entry. It had become about control of space. And neither side had fully taken it yet. The intruder tightened his grip on the weapon. But he did not advance. Because the room no longer reacted like a hospital. It reacted like a system that had already begun adapting. And she had not moved from her position at the center of it. The moment stretched longer than it should have. No one fired. No one rushed. No one broke the silence first. But everything inside Ward 4B had already changed direction. The intruder at the doorway adjusted his stance again. Small, controlled movement. Not retreat, not advance. Observation. Calculation. His weapon remained steady, but his certainty was not. Behind him, the corridor was no longer empty. Footsteps echoed in uneven intervals. Not chaotic running, but coordinated repositioning through the hospital structure. More units were arriving, but their pattern was no longer confident. Something inside the system had slowed them, or misled them. Inside the ward, patients remained low, silent, some trembling, some frozen in disbelief. But the room itself was no longer purely defensive. It was organizing, subtle at first. A curtain pulled tighter to block sight lines. A bed shifted slightly to create cover angles. A nurse guiding a patient without speaking. No commands. Only action. The charge nurse noticed it first, and then hesitated, unsure how to interpret what she was seeing. Because it wasn't panic. It was structure. And structure meant intention. At the center of it, the nurse remained still. Not passive. Anchored. Her eyes moved less now, but each movement carried weight. She was no longer reacting to the intruder in front of her alone. She was tracking the entire space. Entry point. Corridor depth. Patient distribution. Staff positioning. Blind zones. A silent map forming in her mind. The intruder's radio crackled again. Short burst of static. Then a voice. Fragmented. Containment breach expanding. Multiple units delayed. Unclear resistance. The word resistance was not confirmed. But it was enough. The intruder glanced back for half a second. That half-second changed everything. The nurse moved. Not toward him. Not away. Sidestep adjustment into a new line of sight. She was no longer directly facing the weapon. She was offset. Positioned so that any shot would risk hitting patients behind her or the structural column beside her. Not defensive panic. Controlled geometry. The intruder noticed immediately. His weapon followed her shift. "Stop," he said again, but quieter this time. Less command. More uncertainty. She stopped. But she had already completed what she intended. A new angle had been established. And everyone in the room now saw it, without understanding it. A junior doctor whispered, "She's positioning people." No one responded. Because it sounded impossible. But it was happening. Outside the ward, another sound approached. Heavier footsteps. More synchronized. Not intruder movement. Not security response. Something in between. The second figure at the door signaled briefly to the corridor. Then stepped back half a pace. The first intruder remained inside, but now alone in the ward space. Isolation had shifted. Not of the room. Of him. The nurse's gaze briefly shifted toward the corridor again. Timing confirmed. Then back to him. The silence became structured. Pressure without motion. The intruder spoke again. "You are trained." Not a question. An assessment. She did not answer immediately, because answering would define more than necessary. Instead, she said, "This is a hospital." The words were simple, but they carried correction. The intruder did not respond right away, because his training was colliding with something unexpected. Hospitals were not supposed to respond with spatial control. They were supposed to collapse into chaos. But this one was not collapsing. It was stabilizing. Around her. The charge nurse finally spoke, voice low. "We need to keep patients calm." But even she was now watching the nurse differently. Not as junior staff. Not as outsider. But as something she could not classify easily. A sudden noise echoed from the corridor. Closer now. Metal contact. A door forced open somewhere deeper in the wing. The intruder heard it too. His attention flicked again. That hesitation returned. And this time, it lasted slightly longer. The nurse noticed it. Immediately. She took one slow step forward. Not closing distance to attack. Closing space to redirect attention. The intruder's weapon lifted slightly in response, but again, he did not fire. Because the situation was no longer simple entry control. It was layered. Multiple zones. Multiple unknowns. And he was no longer the only one adapting. A patient coughed sharply behind her. Small sound. But it broke the tension for a fraction of a second. The intruder looked toward it instinctively. And that was the opening the room used, not as a weapon, but as a shift. A staff member moved a patient silently into deeper cover. Another adjusted lighting control to reduce glare near the corridor sightline. The nurse remained still. But everything around her had changed position. Without instruction. Only alignment. The intruder stepped back half a step. For the first time. Not retreating fully, but recalibrating distance. His radio crackled again. This time clearer. Fallback not confirmed. Hospital layout compromised. Proceed with caution. Caution. That word did not belong in their original assumption. The nurse noticed the shift in posture. Not fear, but reassessment. And she understood something important in that moment. Control was no longer one-sided. It was contested. Not through force. Through awareness. And the ward, once passive, was now part of that equation. She did not advance. She did not retreat. She simply remained exactly where she was. Because she did not need to chase control. It was already beginning to move toward her. The hospital stopped feeling like a building. It felt like a sealed system under pressure. Every corridor, every locked door, every flickering light was part of something collapsing inward while trying to hold its shape at the same time. Ward 4B no longer received clear updates. Only fragments. Containment compromised. Movement detected in surgical wing. Do not engage alone. Then silence again. Each silence lasted longer than the last. Inside the ward, the intruder had not advanced further, but he had also not left. He stood near the entry line, no longer confident in a straight push forward. Behind him, the corridor remained unstable. Footsteps came and went in uneven cycles. Some closer. Some distant. Some stopping entirely, as if decisions were being made outside the ward that did not fully agree with each other. The nurse remained at the same controlled position within the ward. But now her stillness was no longer passive. It was deliberate containment. Patients were quieter than before, not because fear had disappeared, but because the environment had stabilized around visible control points. And she had become one of them. A child in the far bed whispered, "Are they going to come in again?" No one answered immediately. Because, again, implied certainty of repetition. And nothing was certain anymore. The charge nurse moved closer to the central group of patients. "We stay together," she said softly. "No one moves unless instructed." Her voice was steadier now than before. Not because fear had gone, but because she had begun unconsciously following structure already present in the room. The nurse noticed this shift, but did not acknowledge it. Instead, she turned slightly toward the corridor again. Listening. The siege was tightening. Not explosively. Gradually. Like pressure increasing behind sealed glass. Outside the ward, another impact echoed through the hospital. Then another. But now further away again. Movement was no longer linear. It was fragmented. Which meant coordination was breaking down. Or being challenged. The intruder finally spoke again. Not to the room. But to his radio. Low, controlled tone. "We are not securing fast enough. They are reorganizing internal flow." He paused. That last part was not part of the original expectation. Inside the ward, a patient on oxygen began to struggle slightly. The nurse moved immediately. Adjusting flow. Checking mask seal. Stabilizing without urgency in motion. Her actions were precise. Routine. But in a room under siege, routine becomes structure. And structure becomes influence. A staff member nearby watched her. Then quietly followed her lead without being told. Another patient was repositioned slightly to improve breathing angle. No discussion. Only correction. The intruder noticed it. Again. The room was not behaving like a static target. It was adapting. He shifted his stance slightly. The weapon remained lowered, but readiness had changed. He was no longer aiming at a room. He was tracking a system that was adjusting around him. From the corridor, another voice called out briefly. Not inside the ward. Outside. Short commands. Unclear urgency. The second intruder, still partially outside, spoke into his radio rapidly. Then silence, followed by a decision. He stepped back fully into the corridor. Not retreat. Coordination. The first intruder remained inside. Now isolated. Not physically. Structurally. The nurse observed this change immediately. Separation of unit cohesion. That mattered more than presence. Because isolated pressure behaves differently. More unstable. More reactive. The intruder inside the ward noticed it too. A subtle shift in posture. His radio crackled again. This time sharper. Hold position until confirmation. Hold position. That was not the original plan. The nurse took a slow breath, not visible as tension, but as timing. Then she did something that changed the room without movement. She spoke. Calm. Measured. You will not reach further inside. No threat. No escalation. Just statement. The intruder looked directly at her again. And this time, he did not respond immediately. Because something had changed in his assessment. Not fear. Not confusion. Recognition of resistance that did not behave like resistance. It behaved like control. Outside, distant sirens finally became audible. Real response arriving. But delayed. The hospital was no longer isolated. But it was still not resolved. The siege had tightened into its most dangerous form. Unstable equilibrium. And inside Ward 4B, the nurse remained exactly where she had been since the first breach. Not advancing. Not retreating. But holding the center of a room that was no longer just reacting. It was beginning to decide its own structure. The emergency wing was no longer a single location. It had become a convergence point of movement, pressure, and collapsing control. Footsteps echoed through intersecting corridors in uneven patterns, some urgent, some coordinated, some uncertain. The hospital's internal structure, once predictable, now felt fragmented, as if every section was responding to a different version of the same crisis. Inside Ward 4B, the intruder finally changed position. A subtle shift first, his weight moving backward, heel adjusting on the floor, weapon no longer aimed directly into the center of the room. Not lowered, but no longer anchored. He was recalibrating. The nurse saw it immediately. Not as fear. As structural withdrawal. Behind him, the corridor was active again. Voices overlapped through radios outside the door, sharper now, less controlled than before. East wing not secure. Repeat, regroup at emergency junction. Unknown internal resistance is spreading movement delay. The phrase, movement delay, was incorrect terminology. It revealed confusion in command interpretation. Inside the ward, silence held steady. But it was no longer fragile silence. It was maintained silence. The nurse took a slow step forward. Not toward the intruder. Toward the midpoint of the ward where sightlines were clearest from all angles. Her movement was not aggressive. It was structural correction. The intruder's weapon followed instantly. "Stop," he said again. But the tone had changed. Less command. More urgency. She stopped immediately. Not in submission. In completion. Because she had already reached the position she intended. A position that controlled visibility across the room. And more importantly, the corridor entry. The second figure outside shifted again. A brief shadow crossing the doorway. Then a pause. Communication between them was breaking. Not through failure. Through uncertainty. The intruder inside spoke into his radio. Short burst. Hold position. Need confirmation of external clearance. No immediate response. Only static. That silence changed his posture more than any movement in the room. Because isolation inside a coordinated operation is never part of the plan. The nurse spoke then. Calm. Even tone. You are not coordinating anymore. No accusation. Just observation. The intruder looked directly at her. For the first time, his response did not come immediately. Because she was correct. Outside, command structure was no longer synchronized. Inside, his unit was partially separated. And in between, this room was no longer passive space. It was active structure. The hospital corridor lights flickered again. Emergency red lighting stabilized in longer cycles now. Systems were recovering, but unevenly. A distant announcement played through the intercom. Security teams regaining control of central corridors. Regaining, not securing. That distinction mattered. The intruder shifted again. A half-step backward toward the corridor threshold. Not retreat. Reconnection attempt. The nurse did not follow him. She did not advance. She simply adjusted her stance slightly, aligning herself with the patient line behind her. A quiet repositioning that ensured no direct path to vulnerable space remained unobserved. The intruder noticed that too. Every movement in this room had meaning now. Not chaos. Design. Outside the ward, a louder burst of radio traffic erupted. Then a pause. Then a new voice. Different channel. All units, consolidate at emergency wing. Threat movement contained. Contained. That word arrived late. Inside Ward 4B, the intruder finally lowered his weapon slightly. Not fully, but enough to signal a shift in priority. Not victory. Not defeat. Reassessment. He stepped backward into the corridor. The door remained open. No forced closure. No final breach. Just separation. The nurse did not move as he left. She did not follow. She did not react. She simply remained where she was, as if the room itself still required stability before anything else could be decided. The corridor outside filled with movement again, now clearly emergency responders arriving, not intruders advancing. The structure of the hospital began to reassert itself. Slowly, unevenly, but returning. Inside the ward, patients began to sit up more fully. Some spoke softly. Some simply looked around, trying to understand where the danger ended and normal began again. But the nurse remained still at the center. Not as a figure of attention, but as a reference point the room had unconsciously organized itself around. And even as footsteps of official responders entered the corridor, no one inside Ward 4B fully moved until she finally stepped back toward her duties. Quietly, without announcement, as if nothing about her needed explanation. The hospital did not feel normal when the danger left. It felt empty in a different way. Not absence of people, presence without purpose. Emergency lights had shifted back to steady white, but the corridors still carried the memory of red warning glow. Doors that had been locked were now open again, some hanging slightly ajar as if unsure they were allowed to be normal. Ward 4B remained under controlled access. Security personnel stood at intervals, not rushing, not shouting, just watching, confirming, documenting. Inside the ward, patients were slowly being assessed. Vital signs checked. Injuries treated. Questions asked in calm voices that tried to rebuild trust through routine. But no routine fully fit what had just happened. The charge nurse stood near the central desk, speaking quietly to an emergency responder. "We followed protocol," she said. "We stayed contained." Her voice carried exhaustion more than pride. The responder nodded, writing notes without looking up for long. "Good," he said. That likely prevented escalation. Likely, not certainty. That word lingered. At the far side of the ward, the nurse moved between beds again. Not hurried now. Not scanning threats. Returning. Cleaning what had been disrupted. Adjusting 4 lines. Checking oxygen levels. Speaking softly to patients who were finally beginning to breathe at a normal pace again. A man in bed 7 looked at her for a long moment. "You didn't panic," he said quietly. She adjusted his blanket. "There was no time for it," she replied. Not cold. Not emotional. Just fact. Outside the ward, 2 security officers stood near the corridor entry point. One of them glanced inside briefly, then spoke low. "That's her." The other asked, "Confirmed?" A pause. Then a short reply. Cross-checked with response logs. She was here during full breach cycle. No further explanation followed, but the tone changed slightly after that. Respect without statement. Recognition without announcement. Inside the ward, movement continued to normalize. But something subtle remained different. Staff who had been present during the incident now moved with slightly adjusted awareness around her position. Not avoidance. Not fear. Awareness. As if space around her had gained a new meaning. A paramedic approached the charge nurse. "We're clearing external transfer requests," he said. "Most patients stable." She nodded, then hesitated. "Will there be investigation?" "There always is," he replied. Then added, after a pause. "But this section held better than most during similar incidents." He looked briefly toward the nurse at the bedside, then walked away. The charge nurse followed his gaze, and said nothing. A few minutes passed. The hospital's internal systems began returning to full operational status. Monitors stabilized. Communication channels cleared. Movement outside the ward became less tactical, more procedural. But inside Ward 4B, something still felt unfinished. Not danger. Not tension. Something quieter. Understanding without explanation. A senior security officer entered briefly, scanning the room. His eyes paused when he saw the nurse. He did not speak immediately. Then, simply, he gave a small nod. Not formal. Not announced. Just acknowledgement. The nurse returned the gesture with a slight dip of her head. Nothing more. He left. No questions asked. No conversation needed. Later, as patient transfers began and the ward slowly emptied of emergency presence, the noise of the hospital returned in layers: equipment trolleys, distant announcements, routine footsteps. Normal life rebuilding itself over disrupted structure. The nurse remained until the last critical patient was stabilized. Only then did she step back toward the staff area. No spotlight followed her. No announcement marked her contribution. But the people who had been there remembered one thing clearly. When everything stopped behaving like a hospital, she did not. And that was enough to change how the room was understood. Morning did not arrive with relief. It arrived with exhaustion. The hospital corridors were clean again, but not reset. Scrubbed floors could not erase what had moved through them. Staff walked slower than usual, not from fatigue alone, but from the afterimage of a night that had not behaved like any normal emergency cycle. Ward 4B was nearly empty now. Patients had been stabilized or transferred to other units. Equipment had been replaced. Security presence reduced to standard monitoring. On paper, everything had returned to normal operations. But no one inside believed it fully. The charge nurse stood at the station, reviewing reports that would later become documentation, summaries, classifications. Her pen paused once, then continued. No comments were added outside required fields, because some details did not belong in forms. At the far end of the corridor, the nurse finished adjusting the last bed rail for a remaining patient awaiting transfer. Her movements were as precise as they had been at the beginning of the night. Nothing about her pace had changed. Only the context around her had. The patient looked at her for a long moment before being wheeled out. "You'll be here tomorrow?" he asked. A simple question. She did not answer immediately. Then, calmly, "Yes." Not promise. Not reassurance. Just schedule. The patient nodded, as if that was enough. And in this environment it was. Outside Ward 4B, 2 security officers stood near the corridor junction. One of them spoke quietly. Command requested full incident review. The other replied, "There's nothing to report beyond containment success." A pause. Then, "Still, there's her presence in all timelines." No one expanded on that, because it was not a technical term. It was observation. Inside the ward, the nurse removed a pair of gloves and disposed of them properly. Then checked her watch once. Her shift was technically still ongoing, but the intensity had already ended. She walked toward the staff corridor. Passing the glass observation panel, she did not stop. But a few people on the other side of the corridor did. Not staring. Not gathering. Just noticing. A subtle shift in posture. Acknowledgement without disruption. No one called her name loudly. No one stopped her. Because nothing about her suggested she should be stopped. She reached the staff exit corridor where daylight from outside hospital windows cut across the floor in long, quiet lines. For a brief moment, she paused. Not dramatically. Just long enough to register the transition from controlled environment to open space. Then she continued walking. Behind her, the hospital returned fully to its rhythm. Monitors, announcements, footsteps, life resuming its structured noise. But something remained altered in how certain people moved. Not fear. Not awe. Awareness. Because when the report was finally written and the incident was reduced to language and classification, one line appeared in multiple accounts without being agreed upon. Ward stability maintained by nursing staff under extreme breach conditions. No names highlighted. No roles expanded. But everyone who had been there understood what it meant. And somewhere in the building, a senior officer closed the file and paused for a moment longer than necessary before saying, "Keep her on record." Outside, the nurse stepped into the daylight. No convoy waited. No recognition followed. No announcement marked her departure. Only the quiet return of a world that would never fully know what held it together that night. And then she was gone.